He's authored more than 200 articles on cryptography and is recognized as an expert in his field. He is the author of the very first reference book on electronic identity documents. He's known to have a very special skill in explaining complex principles in simple terms. Maybe later on you can explain elliptic curve cryptography too. Welcome, Klaus.
Well, thank you and welcome to my presentation. Can I have something like a presenter?
Clicker on podium.
This one? Yeah. No. Okay, thank you. Well, my name is Klaus Schmeh. I work for the German company CryptoVision. We specialize in cryptography and electronic identity cards. And I'm going to give an overview on identity initiatives. And to do so, we need a model. And this looks like this. Well, we have on the left side a user. And this user needs a lot of different passwords. For each server, a different one. And as you can imagine, this grows to a number of 10 or 15 different passwords, and that's of course too much for an ordinary human, and this may easily lead to a password overflow. On the other side, we have an administrator. He has a quite similar problem. He has to deal with a lot of different identities. Well, of course, the model is a little simplified because in reality we have different operators and different administrators. But to make it simple, in this model we think there's only one administrator, but he needs to care about a lot of different identities, and this may easily lead to an identity overflow. And I hope you now get the two main problems we are dealing with. And of course, this is a threat for the identity world. And what we need is a kind of superhero to save it. And here he is. And, well, this is the theory. Practice looks a little different. In practice, we really have a superhero, but there's not only one. There are about 10, and there's probably little gained by having so many superpowers to solve one certain problem. Or to say it in a different way, we have about 10 or even more different initiatives, all trying to solve more or less the same problem, dealing with passwords and identities. And these are, well, I'm introducing 9 of them. There are more, but these are the 9 most important ones. These are identity initiatives, and now the goal of my presentation is to give an overview what the differences are between these identity initiatives and what their goals are. So let's start with 4 of them. 4 of these identity initiatives that currently are active have a very similar approach. They focus on the user side of the model. There is something like a super server. Well, this is not a technical term, but I call it a super server in this context. And the user needs to log in only once, and all the other logins are made automatically. So the one login is transferred to the other servers. And this concept is, of course, named single sign-on. You've probably heard of this expression before. And as I said, there are different initiatives following this concept. For example, there's OpenID, and they say SSO is our approach. We use URLs as identifiers. But there's also Mozilla Persona. They say pretty much the same. SSO is our approach, but they use email addresses as identifiers. And there's also Facebook Connect. They say SSO is our approach. We use Facebook accounts as identities. And there's Microsoft account, and they also consider SSO as their approach, and they use Microsoft accounts as identities. So as it seems, a superhero fight is inevitable. Now the question is, of course, who is going to win? Well, in fact, I don't know. I can't look to the future, but my guess is that all 4 initiatives will continue to be operative and that all of them will have their market share. Probably at the moment, OpenID is the most popular concept. It's a simple concept in an independent solution with open source implementation. Mozilla Persona is similar, but a lot smaller so far. And of course, Microsoft account is very attractive for all of those who already have a Microsoft account, for example, for their Windows Live or their Xbox Live activities. So it's certainly interesting for many, but not for all, and the same can be said for Facebook Connect. It's interesting for everybody who has a Facebook account. Many people have that, but of course not everybody. So my guess is that all of these 4 initiatives will continue to be active. But some of these identity initiatives have a different approach. They focus on authentication, or to be more precise, on the means of authentication. So they don't deal with single sign-on. Instead, they deal with the authentication method, or it's not a password, it's usually an identity or a smart card or something else I will show you. And the most important initiative of this kind is the FIDO Alliance. The FIDO Alliance is an industry consortium, and their main goal is to abolish password or kill passwords, as has been said in the earlier presentation. And passwords should be replaced, according to them, with more secure means of authentication like smart cards, biometry, trusted platform modules, secure elements, near-field communication and USB tokens. These are considered the best means of authentication and the most secure and the most convenient. And they are certainly better than passwords. But there's also another initiative with very similar goals, NSTIC, which stands for National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. NSTIC is a US consortium, and their goal is to establish easy-to-use and interoperable identity credentials. Well, as I said, NSTIC and FIDO Alliance look pretty similar at first view, and it might be that some of them do says, there is not enough room for the 2 of us in this identity world, and that the next superhero fight is going to start. But in fact, this is not the case. Instead, it can be said that the 2 are friends, more or less, but there's an important difference between the FIDO Alliance and NSTIC. While the FIDO Alliance cares about the whole world, NSTIC is only active in the United States, and in fact, the goal of NSTIC is to fulfill the FIDO requirements, or at least one goal, so there's no real competition between the 2. And there's one other initiative focusing on the authentication method. That's ECC, which stands for European Citizen Cards. And this one is about electronic identity cards. As you might know, there are quite many countries in the world issuing electronic identity cards like my home country Germany, but also Belgium, Nigeria. There's nothing like this in the USA, at least no national identity card. But there are many other countries, and it's a very complicated situation because the last 15 or 16 years, very many of these projects have been started, and it's a complete mess because every project is different. And in this case, again, we need a superhero to save the world or to unify it, and here he is. And what does he say? Well, in fact, he says it's too much of a chaos, even for a superhero. So there is no worldwide identity, or no worldwide initiative to unify electronic identity cards. Well, I know that there's ICAO, and I know that their standard contains a few details about electronic identity cards, but that's only a very small part of what identity or electronic identity cards are about. So we have to live with the fact that we have a lot of different projects in the world and that many of them are pretty different. But, well, I'm European. In Europe, we at least try to solve this problem with the standard European citizen card. We have, in Europe, this standard was introduced to standardize electronic identity cards, which is again pretty difficult because even the European electronic identity cards are pretty different. The first ones were introduced about 15 or 16 years ago, and it simply came too early, or the standard came too late to make a real standardization. So even in Europe, it's a pretty mess, but at least there's an organization or there's a standard that tries to unify this market, but it's pretty difficult. A few other initiatives of the ones I'm introducing today are about identity federation. And identity federation is mainly on the other side of the model. Now we are speaking about the administrator. In this case, if an administrator wants to, or he only needs to establish an identity once, and by identity federation, this identity is transferred to other servers, or that's what is identity federation about. And the result is finally pretty similar to single sign-on, because there's a single sign-on effect, because if good identity federation is made, the user only has to log in once, and all the other federated identity servers can use the one login, but it's a more holistic approach than only single sign-on. There's the security assertion markup language that's a standard for identity federation, and it can be used for other things as well, but it's a very important and a very useful tool to do identity federation. There are different implementations of SAML. The most important ones in this context are Schmeh. That's again something like a single sign-on and identity federation implementation. And some of you might remember the Liberty Alliance, which also had identity federation as its goal, but it's now integrated in the Kantara initiative, which is a bigger initiative, and identity federation is only a small part of it, but it's again a SAML implementation. And now let's look at the last initiative, or actually there are 3 of them, as you will see. They are about authorization. In this case, the user doesn't want to log in to several different servers. Instead, he wants to access his data. He wants to access, for example, photographs that are stored on one server, and he wants to have them on another server as well. And this is the purpose of the oath standard and the oath protocol. So oath can be used for sharing information like photographs between different servers, and this is done in this case. It's not about single sign-on, it's about authorization. But again, life is a little more difficult or more complicated than it actually would be necessary, because we have oath version 1, which is quite simple, but many consider it as quite good, quite effective. Then we have oath version 2, which some of the people regard as pretty complicated, and the developer of oath version 1 has now, he's not active in the movement anymore, and he recommends the use of version 1, and he doesn't like version 2 at all. So we have 2 implementations of the same idea, and then there was even a third implementation named RAP, which was pretty similar, but meanwhile RAP was abandoned and integrated into oath version 2. So things have become a little more simple, but still we have to deal with 2 different implementations. Now let's come to the conclusion. Well, first of all, I've introduced 9 or 10 identity initiatives, and that's of course too much, but at least some of these initiatives are clearly complementary, because they use on different parts of the model. Some of them directly on the user side, on the application means, others on the single sign-on part, other on the identity part. So there's certainly room for several of them. Some of them cooperate, like Fido and NSTIC. And there are also competing identity initiatives like OpenID, Mozilla Persona, Facebook Connect, and Microsoft Account. And as I said, I expect that all of them will have their market share. And if we want to know how the future looks like and which one of these initiatives will win, we have to travel to the future. Well, I can do it, but maybe a superhero can. And what will happen? We will transfer our superhero to the year 2020. But in fact, time traveling doesn't work even for a superhero. So if you want to know what will happen in the year 2020, we'll have to wait for another 5 years. Thank you.